This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome back to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam. I'm your host, and we are helping take your leadership to the next level. And to do that, I have Richard Blackaby with me.
Good to be with you as always, Sam.
Always a pleasure. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, so I think we'll just jump right in.
Sure.
We are doing the segment about where we look at great leaders throughout history. And today, why don't you tell us who we're looking at?
I thought today we would look at the United States' 18th president.
18th.
Which is?
If I had to guess, I'd say Grant.
Ulysses S. Grant. Yeah. Which is a little interesting right now because he's shown up. There's been a little bit of controversy recently. A lot of the rioting that's been taking place lately. His statue was torn down, which was kind of interesting since he is the one that essentially brought an end to the Civil War and to the freeing of all slaves.
Yeah.
And yet Grant's also quite a controversial character in a lot of ways. So he doesn't always he's not always cited as an example of great leadership for just a couple of reasons. And I quite frankly, I feel like history has not been fair to Grant. So we're going to set the record straight today.
Yeah, well, glad we're doing this then.
You know, Grant, like a lot of the people we've looked at, I'd say all the people we've looked at, is a flawed person. And the problem right now, actually, with some of the things going on in society is that we look back into history, and if a person had a flaw, if they weren't perfect, we condemn them and throw out all the contributions they made. And the fact is, for me, I'm always more impressed with someone who accomplishes a lot, even though they had shortcomings. To manage to overcome shortcomings personally so that they can make a contribution to society at large, I think is quite significant.
Which, I don't know that there is a figure in history who didn't have some shortcomings that they had to overcome.
And Grant, there's things about him, I think, just purely from a leadership perspective that make him someone certainly worth looking at closely. He actually, I was looking, and he is if you go to Andrew Jackson, who was elected for 2 terms and served his full 2 terms in the 1830s, you don't find another person who is elected 2 times in a row and serves out his full 8 years healthily until basically Franklin Roosevelt. You've got Wilson that is elected twice, but he actually suffers a stroke in the 2nd term and is all but an invalid. His wife is kind of running the White House in the last months of his presidency. But so if you don't count Wilson, then and Theodore Roosevelt also serves almost 2 terms, but of course he's not elected the first term. McKinley is assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt just takes over. And so, as far as being elected 2 times in a row and serving all 8 years, you go about 100 years, and the only guy to do it is Grant. And so that's to me pretty significant. And of course, Grant also essentially brings an end to the Civil War. And if you are a student of the Civil War, just looking at it militarily, the South just took it to the North for some time. And even though the North had more industry, they could make cannons and bullets, and they had better train system and all those kind of advantages materially. And they had more people in the North. They could recruit more soldiers. All the advantages pretty well lay with the North, and yet they kept losing. And they couldn't seem to defeat Robert E. Lee. And Abraham Lincoln was stressing out, trying to find someone who would just go down there and beat Lee, like just go take it to him. And he'd get all these generals who were all very ambitious, wanting to be famous, loving the limelight, but they just couldn't do the hard work of going toe-to-toe with an adversary and overcoming him. And so until Grant comes along. And Grant is able finally to bring an end to the war. And I think when you understand that, when you understand how many people tried before him, then you can certainly appreciate what he finally was able to accomplish.
So what would you say is that what made him capable of doing that?
You know, if we've looked at this before, and it just seems almost as if a prerequisite to being a great leader is that you have to have struggled earlier on in your life. And Grant is one of those people that just, I guess what it kind of endears me to him is that he had such a difficult early part to his adult life. He's a small of stature person, basically. When he, and the thing about Grant is the first half of his life is just almost a series of failures, of just different problems and obstacles coming up that seem to just almost curse him to never being able to be successful. He's not. He ultimately is about 5'7" tall.
Which is unusual for a leader.
Yeah, to be typically you're bigger of stature. He was about 135 pounds. So he's not a big man. He goes to West Point, but even that is a mistake. His in-laws are Democrats and they're slaveholders, and so when he applies to West Point, a congressman decides he's kind of reluctant to even recommend him to West Point, but he finally does. But the guy doesn't really know who Grant is, and so he submits his name improperly. His name was actually Hiram Ulysses Grant, but the guy puts in the name as just Ulysses S. Grant. He actually submits his application to West Point with the wrong name. And he becomes known by that name for the rest of his life. And so
that's interesting.
Right off the bat, Grant is like, his name is completely bungled, and he has to live with that the rest of his life. And it's almost as if all the powers that be just could not seem to get Grant right for the longest time. And so he goes to West Point, and he finishes 21 out of 39 in his class. He is it's interesting. He's almost at the bottom of his class in subjects like tactics, which is very interesting since he'll end up being the leading general in the entire Civil War. The only thing he's good at is riding horses. In fact, there was a horse there that was so wild, so strong that nobody could ride him except Grant. And he at one point took that horse and jumped a barricade in a sort of a contest, and jumped higher than anyone had ever jumped on a horse before at West Point, and his record stood for about 25 years. But the thing about Grant is that he's a very humble guy, and he goes out of the war, and when he graduates, he has to serve his about 4 years or so obligatory service. But he gets married, and he's a family man. In fact, his biographer says he would have happily been just a family man, a rumpled sort of shopkeeper that history never heard of if it hadn't been for the Civil War. And so he kind of is putting in his time, but he gets sent all the way out to California, and he's missing his wife and missing his kids. He's a homebody, and ultimately he takes to some drinking. And the biographer says that Grant he was known as a cigar smoking guy. He'd smoke about 24 cigars a day, and ultimately he's going to die of throat cancer. But he's also known as a hard drinking man, and some of that just comes from the legend that he ultimately gets drummed out of the army because of his drinking. The biographer says he's only 135 pounds and he couldn't hold his liquor. He said so he'd take one drink and start slurring his words, and so. He kind of contends that he didn't drink nearly as much as legend kind of made him to be. It's just that
it didn't take much.
It didn't take much, and even if he's slurring his words, it didn't mean he was necessarily drunk. It just meant he started to sound like he'd been drinking, and so he actually gets drummed out of the army. Now here's a guy who's going to end up being the highest ranking military leader, perhaps in American history at that point. And he gets run out of the army. Now that ought to tell you that just because you have a tough beginning doesn't mean that you can't succeed later on. And so he begins looking for the next 7 or so years at just trying to find some kind of work of some sort. And when you read his biography, which by the way we'll put in the show notes, but a great biography on him is by Gene Edwards Smith. I just found it very well done, very enlightening, very sympathetic toward Grant, certainly, but without necessarily, whitewashing his shortcomings. But when you read that, you're just blown away by how many times he goes broke, how many times he gets overlooked, or a partner doesn't pay him what he's owed, or the government, even though he's the best qualified person, the government hires someone who's in the same political party as they are instead of Grant. And it gets to be just humiliating for him. He's got a wife and kids. He's just trying to provide for his family. Yeah. He goes into farm. I mean, it's like you'd think this had to be made up. I mean, he'll buy a farm and he'll have this wonderful crop. And then all of a sudden there'll be a huge downturn in the economy, and produce is worthless, or there'll be a big flood, or at one point he and a partner bought a big block of ice, and a ship was bringing it down, and they're going to make a fortune selling ice in San Francisco. Well, then there's a huge headwinds. The ship comes in 3 weeks late, and the ice is all melted. It's just like unbelievable. And now the thing about Grant that the author does say is that he was scrupulously honest. And now later, when he's president, there's going to be some scandals that will take place in his administration. And that's part of why Grant is not rated more highly as a president. But the fact is, Grant was never charged personally with any kind of wrongdoing of any kind. What the biographer says is that he never met a businessman that he didn't trust. He's a pretty trusting person. And part of that, I really believe, is because Grant was fundamentally an honest man. Yeah. And he just couldn't see guile in other people. And certainly that was a weakness as a leader, was that he would trust people he shouldn't. And so that particularly does him in business. He's just taken to the cleaners over and over and over again. And he won't lie. He won't embellish anything for a sale. And so he's too honest really to be a good salesman, but he's too kind-hearted to take advantage of other people. And so there's just like a dozen different times where he tries a business, and he's sure this time that he's going to make a good living and be able to provide for his family. And then some natural disaster or economic downturn or embezzling partner or something will happen, and he ends up destitute. And so he has to sell. He gets down to where he's selling firewood on street corners. And yet, what's interesting too about Grant is there's a wonderful story. It's kind of ironic because Grant he goes to West Point and he's with a bunch of people. For instance, Stonewall Jackson will come along near the end of his time there. General Longstreet is a student and becomes actually Grant's best friend. And of course, Longstreet is going to be General Lee's right-hand man through the Civil War, fighting for the South. And Grant is going to be fighting Longstreet, who was his, I think, his best man in his wedding. And so it sort of helps you appreciate the Civil War, what it did. In fact, 3 ushers at Grant's wedding will all surrender to Grant at Appomattox. I can never say that right. At the end of the Civil War, he's got 3 ushers and a groomsman all surrendering to him from his own wedding. Yeah. And so at one point, when Grant is at his worst, where he's got no money, he can't get a job no matter how hard he tries. He sees Longstreet, passes him in the street, hasn't seen him since his wedding. And he comes back the next day with a $5 gold coin, hands it to Longstreet and says, "I've owed you this for some time, and I'd be mortified not to pay you now that I know where you are and I can give it to you." And Longstreet can tell by his tattered clothes and the fact he's been selling firewood that the Grant needs the money far more than Longstreet does. But Grant just insists and says, "No, a debt owed. I just couldn't live with myself without paying it." Here's a guy who can't feed his family, but wants to live with integrity. And so that's kind of the person Grant is. Ultimately, he just cannot find a living out of the Army. And so he finally goes back to his father. His dad runs a tannery business, and asks his dad if he can work. He'd vowed he'd never ask his dad for a job, but he finally has no choice. He does, and ends up, his dad, the only job he's got for him at the time is kind of a clerk where he has to work for two of his younger brothers. It's just a humiliating, and he's not paid all that much. It's just as kind of a starter job. And that's basically what he's doing when the Civil War breaks out. And so he goes to apply to volunteer in the Army, and the general that he goes and tries to meet with keeps him waiting for days, never does really talk to him. And here's a guy, again, who's going to end up being the highest ranking military man in the entire country when the Americans had the biggest army they'd ever had. And he can't even get a hearing to apply into the Army, to get back in. In fact, he right before he finally does get enlisted, he said he actually said, I'll be a baker. I'll bake bread for the Army. Just let me do something to help the cause. And he can't even get a job baking bread for the Army, and yet he will ultimately be the top military commander by the end of the Civil War. And that's one of those things where you just look and say, here's what history does. You know, it's if it had not been for the Civil War at that time, we'd never know of Grant. Certainly he'd never be the president.
If you like what we're doing and would like to support our work, please consider making a donation. Even a little bit will go a long way toward keeping this podcast going for the months and years to come. To support this podcast, click on the link in the show notes. We are truly grateful for our wonderful community of listeners.
Finally, it's like when you read that period in his life, it's like everything goes, it's like the gods, the Greek gods, who are just determined to make everything he tries fail, just like he's cursed. Finally, he's believe in Illinois, and somebody, there's a regiment that's been recruited out of Illinois, and the commanding officer cannot control his men. And these men have actually rioted and destroyed property and looted, and they have to fire the commanding officer. And so somebody says, I think let's get Grant. He served in the Army back during the Mexican-American War. Let's get Grant. And there's a big debate, but finally they agree. This is the most unruly unit in the entire Union Army. And there's a wonderful story where these guys they've rioted and looted and run off the previous commanding officer. Grant comes in. He's got ragged clothes, it's threadbare uniform from like 15 years earlier. He looks slovenly. Grant never walked. In fact, Grant despised show and pomp and circumstance. He always dressed down. There's an interesting story when he first got his real uniform at West Point. He actually put on his finest uniform and went strutting into town thinking everybody would be impressed with him. And two different people made fun of him, a kid and then a drunkard, imitating this wannabe soldier walking down the street. And Grant was so humiliated by that for the rest of his life, he would never wear a sword, and he'd never wear any of the ostentatious sort of accoutrements that go with military dress. He always dressed down, always looked really kind of scruffy. And so he comes scruffy to this unit that's just run off its commanding officer. And the people who witnessed it said a number of these unruly soldiers begins to make fun of him and to kind of laugh at, like, this is who's going to be. We ran off a real officer. Now we got this wannabe guy that hasn't even been able to hold a job in like almost a decade. And they said one look from Grant, and the biographer says they just knew that they were dealing with a different kind of man. And and now Grant was never strict authoritarian. In fact, what Grant does is he immediately stops a bunch of the former guy would have them marching all day long in the heat of the day and just kind of silly rules that weren't necessary. Grant was always a person that just stayed focused and kept it simple, and he very quickly endeared himself to his men and ended up with one of the best trained disciplined units in the army. And the biographer says Grant always had his critics, but you never found any critics among the men that he commanded. The people that he actually led, people from afar would look and criticize, but nobody that worked with him criticized him. And so he begins his upward trek, and he had some interesting things to say. Like he was kept things very simple. He's not a brilliant man. He didn't finish very high in. Interestingly, that in his class and during when he was there, two of the people that for himself, number one, and then Stonewall Jackson also didn't finish very high. And what's interesting is they were good at actually leading. They weren't really good at writing tests in school about leading. And so, but he would say things like that when it came in terms of focus, he would say things like, the art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike him as hard as you can and as often as you can, and keep moving on. he just kind of said, keep it simple. His biographer says something interesting. He says, every setback seemed to enhance his inner strength. Grant was not brilliant. His appearance was not striking. His personality did not shine. He was not visited by the flashes of inspiration that animated Stonewall Jackson. He did not have Lee's Olympian presence. His mind lacked the subtleties of Lincoln's thought. Sometimes he blundered badly. Often he oversimplified. Yet he saw his goals clearly and moved toward them relentlessly.
You just get the sense that, that the dark period of his life where he couldn't hold a job down, that was building that perseverance, that grit, even that we've talked about before, that he's just not going to let it go until he reaches that goal.
Yeah, and it humbled him, and his biographer says he was different than all the commanding officers before him because he couldn't be swayed by flattery. Yeah, he had that knocked out of him early on in his life, and in fact, there's a story I think after the Battle of Chattanooga that there were hundreds and hundreds of Southern soldiers that were being taken away as prisoners, and they're all glumly being marched along, and Grant rides up with all of his officers, and all the other Northern officers are kind of smugly looking at this Southern trash being marched away to their prison camps, and they're the victors. And the biographer said, as Grant watches all these his enemies being led away to prison, Grant raises his hat and holds his hat up in tribute to his fallen enemy or his defeated enemies until the last Southerner walked by. Well, it was one of the prisoners who actually told that story later and said, and they just said after what Grant had been through, there's just no way he could be vindictive. He had been humbled, and so when he saw someone else humbled, he knew what it felt like. In fact, when General Lee finally has to surrender at the end of the Civil War, Grant actually writes very honorable terms for him, where he can keep his honor and the soldiers. And Grant, of course, has fought this very bloody, costly war, but he wants there to be peace. And in fact, when they finally signed the treaty, and there was a Northern officer that wanted to have all the bugles play kind of a victory song as all the Southerners are having to march off, and Grant stopped him and said, "Those are our brothers now. Those aren't our enemies anymore. They're our brothers. Let's start treating them like brothers." When after Lincoln is assassinated, Johnson becomes president, and he decides that he wants to punish Lee and Jefferson Davis, basically wants to hang them. After all the Northern soldiers who'd been killed in fighting against Lee, he felt like Lee should go on trial and be hanged for his crimes. And basically, Grant is the one that stops it. In fact, Grant says, "I'll resign right now in protest if you arrest Lee." He said, "We signed terms with him. As long as he keeps his terms, let's not be vindictive. Let's start healing and not keep on wedging differences between us." And the thing about Grant is, even when he was his poorest, when he was the most destitute, at one point, his father-in-law gave him a slave. Just, here's a gift, happy birthday, here's a slave. And at that time, the slave would have been worth maybe $1,000, which in our day would be, maybe upwards of $50,000. And Grant was unemployed. Grant was desperate for money. In fact, one Christmas he had to sell his only valuable thing he owned left was his gold watch. He sold it just so his family could have presents and food for Christmas. So he's given this $1,000 gift of a slave. At the very least, he could have sold the slave, but he just couldn't stand the thought of having a slave or the principle of slavery, and so he sets his slave free. Doesn't even earn $1 from it. And here's a guy that's destitute, selling firewood on street corners to feed his family, but he just sets his slave free. But Grant had seen the pain of failure and that kind of thing. And so Grant, of course, finally fights against Lee, and all the other Northern commanders were scared to death of Lee. They were more afraid of what Lee would do to them. And in fact, at one point, when Grant's finally in charge, he chastises his officers and says, "Stop worrying about what Lee is going to do to you, and start thinking about what you can do to Lee." And and all the other officers were trying to avoid Lee. When Grant's finally in charge of the whole army, he turns to General Meade, who works under him, and he says, "This is what I want you to do." He says, "Wherever Lee goes, you shall go there too also." He said, "Just follow Lee." And everybody else tried to fight battles of positioning, like a chess match, where you didn't actually fight very much. You just tried to outmaneuver and position and so on. Grant said, you'll never defeat him that way. The only way to win the war is you got to destroy the enemy. So just keep pounding away at the enemy. And at a certain point, that caused a lot of casualties, of course. And sometimes people looked at Grant and said, well, he's just this hard-drinking general that doesn't care about his officers and his men. But Grant just understood that, in fact, when it's first announced that Grant is now in charge of the Northern Army, a bunch of the Southern generals and officers all laughed and said, "Oh, General Lee will have his way with Grant. Grant's just a bumbling drunkard." And Longstreet, who was like probably the number 2 man under Lee, he said, "No, you're dealing with a different man." He said, "I was the groomsman in his wedding. I was in school with him." He said, "You better get ready to just get toe-to-toe with this guy and stay in the ring with him, because he won't quit. He won't give up. He won't be discouraged." And basically, it wasn't pretty, it wasn't brilliant, but that's what he does, and ultimately he's victorious. And his downfall is that he's too trusting. He's he's very loyal to his friends, even to a fault, and so he brings some people in around him. Grant was never ever accused of being corrupt, but he brings some people in that ultimately will fall to some corruption. And unfortunately, he trusted people that shouldn't have been trusted, which certainly is a leadership shortfall on his part. But when you watch the way he treated the South after he's president, he has a very enlightened approach to that whole issue, and I think that history is now beginning to see his contributions and the integrity of his leadership in a light that's much more positive than it used to be. And so when you talk about Grant as a leader, oftentimes you immediately say, well, wasn't he just a hard-drinking kind of guy? Yeah. And even after he finishes being president, when he was president, there was no retirement fund. Once you weren't president anymore, you didn't get paid anything. And so he's destitute, and ultimately he has terminal cancer, throat cancer. And it looks like he's going to leave his wife and kids with destitute, penniless, which just breaks his heart. And Mark Twain actually comes along at that time and wants to get Grant's memoirs written, and he helps him and says, if you'll just, I'll help you get these published, and your wife will have money and so on. And so as he's dying, Grant is writing his memoirs, and even though he's in some extreme pain, and ultimately Grant basically just starves to death because he has no feeling in his mouth anymore, and he can't eat. He finally just can't eat anymore, and he ultimately will die that way. But when he's done, to his word, Mark Twain gets his memoirs published, and they are wild bestsellers. I think over 500,000 copies are sold quite soon. And even to this day, they're considered one of the best presidential memoirs that have ever been written.
Wow.
And he does it as he's dying, basically to provide for his wife and kids. And so right to the very end, it's just a tragic figure, that so many ways it seemed like life and fate are going against him. And when you look at that and then you realize what he accomplishes, you realize, wow, he, for a humble guy who'd been knocked to the mat a number of times, he accomplished a lot. And I think that's an inspiration to each of us to say, you don't have to be a giant, brilliant. You just got to be a guy who perseveres and looks for that moment that God has you on this planet to make your contribution as well.
Well, that's great, and we'll leave links to in the show notes to the biography that you used, and it's always fascinating to see these leaders from history.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.